All right, welcome to another episode of the SourceMagnetic Podcast. So this is Shannon Allen, and I'm here with my good friend and business partner, Tommy Allen.
Hey, Shannon, happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday, man. So we're just gonna jump right into it. The previous podcast was really cool, but we're gonna keep a similar theme. Why Africa? Why now? And right now. But last time we talked about a bunch of things. So this time I think we're gonna keep it really focused and talk about a couple of key challenges. Tommy, what do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. And just to follow up on that theme, and especially as we got into the podcast last week, or last time, whatever I started saying last week, but I think it's been a couple of weeks now, brother. So let's just jump right into it. And one of the topics that we discussed, pretty heavily was some of the areas in South Africa, Namibia, and some of the ideas around why Africa right now. And we talked a little bit about real estate, and other topics like that. But one of the things I also wanted to say is in the same vein as we discussed last time, where we were discussing the various, Cape Town and all the rest of the areas, Watamu, some of the areas in Kenya. There's another side to that. I think we need to, let everybody understand and know is that obviously there's issues and problems in some of these areas. And one of those, and it was kind of disappointing to see the late May issue of The Economist and discussing, South Africa. And I think it was somewhat, I was somewhat taken aback, I should say, by the idea that, South Africa might be turning into a failed state. And I think what they meant by that was that there was a lot of joy and happiness when Cyril Ramaphosa was coming into power, simply because the business leaders were extremely happy because it was one of their own. So they assumed that there would be changes to policies, there would be infrastructure development, it would continue along those lines. Well, unfortunately, coming out of the kleptocracy that was Zuma's, Jacob Zuma's, presidency, I think there was a lot of hopeful people out there that were thinking that South Africa is going to make a big change, and especially on the business side. That hasn't necessarily happened. So I think, when we talk about any of these areas in the same way that we talk about the United States or any other place, is that you have to temper it, and there has to be a level of expectation and understanding that, yes, while there are some great things going on in these places and locations, there's also the other side of it, which may have some negativity. So I think one of the things that I wanted to touch on just a little bit was to say, thinking about going to any of these countries, or whether it's moving across the country, as we talked about a lot last time, whether from California to Florida, Florida to Texas, et cetera, New York to Texas, Texas to, New Hampshire, whatever the case may be. You have to really do your due diligence and look at these areas that you're thinking about moving into. But again, staying around that topic of why Africa, why now, there's a lot of reasons why. And I think we've touched on a lot of those. But I also just want to say, and we can discuss this in more detail and hopefully have another podcast around this specific issue, is that, do your due diligence, look at these areas and make sure you understand what you're getting into, because there are some incredible opportunities. And I myself, again, I've been going out there for almost 45 years to the African continent. And it's definitely not a place that I shy away from them. It's just like any other, state we have here in the nation, in the sense that, there's problems and issues. So you work around those. But I think what I'm, want to highlight and try to, tell people out there is that, do your due diligence, look into these areas, but it's definitely worthwhile. And you and I are definitely not going to back down from it. Our impetus is, if you will, is to, to move into, other areas in Africa and to do business there. So just wanted to kind of highlight those things, Shannon.
I mean, at least you gave people a warning. I'm an optimist and I get excited about opportunity, but with no risk, you won't get a reward if you don't take some risks here and there. So I know Tommy's a big risk taker. I've been a risk taker all my life. I've worked for myself since the year 2000. So, it's not for the faint of heart, but if you want to make some big wins, you have the best potential if you can find an opportunity like Africa right now. So, it's like Tommy said, it's not without its risk, but do your due diligence, and depending on what you're trying to do and who you're trying to work with, that's going to say the most, because you can't just automatically pop over and just expect to pop up shop and start doing business in Africa. You got to know some people, and you got to know the lay of the land and actually go over there, or have somebody like Tommy on your team to help you out. But for the most part, it's not like the United States at all, but it has some elements that are similar to the United States. So you got to do your due diligence, like how Tommy said, but for the most part, it's a lot of major opportunities because it's on the upswing. It's got a youth economy where it's a lot of young people, a lot of intelligent, internet-minded people. So depending on what your, I guess, your business is, and you see if there's opportunity to go into Africa and expand your business, hey, why not? But we're here to talk about all sides, not just the good parts, but we'll let people know that there are some some hurdles here and there. If you can get past them, and you're good. So I mean, what are your thoughts, Tommy?
No, spot on. And I think we kind of touched it. And, I bring up South Africa because that's a place that, along with Kenya and a couple of other, countries on the continent, I've spent most of my life in and out of those countries. So, speaking some of the languages and understanding the, having worked with the ANC, from a diplomatic, standpoint, and being in Zambia when the ANC and Mkhonto we Sizwe, these groups were exiled in Lusaka, I have a long history there. So I have a lot of love for that country. And as I say, but they're going through some tough times, just like a lot of other countries. But hopefully they'll sort it out, and Cyril Ramaphosa will, get them back on track, and they'll start to look at some of these chinks in the armor, if you will, in the same manner that we have the same chinks in the armor here. We're starting to have some failed infrastructure. We need to think about that here in the same way down there. South Africa's always been sort of the leading, country on that continent in terms of, the building and what's there and the opportunities. And I would just hate to see those go by the wayside. Very similar to what we were talking about with Namibia and the opportunities there, because of the natural resources, et cetera. And you could say the same thing for, the Congo, DRC, et cetera, is that there's so many natural resources and so many opportunities there that I just don't want to see them squandered because of corruption, et cetera, or not thinking about the opportunities for the people of those countries. So again, we're not going to shy away from it. Africa is an incredible place. There's 54 African countries there, and I would argue that most people couldn't even name 20 of them. And that's why we're doing this, is to make people aware, obviously, of what's out there on the continent, the availability of opportunities, and then slowly move across the continent, if you will, north to south, et cetera, and start to talk a lot about these countries and the opportunities there. So definitely we're not shying away from it. Africa is where we've kind of, put our bet, if you will, and we've been working out there for, a number of years, and we don't intend on leaving the continent.
Well, that's a big point here. So if anybody's looking to do business in Africa, and this is one of the reasons why we started this podcast, just to let people know what's going on, give a lay of the land. And if people are interested and they actually follow this podcast, let us know if you're looking into getting into Africa or any specific country in Africa, and just starting some networking talks. So we're going to be sharing this on all of the social platforms, but let's run into the main key 3 topics, because I was talking to Tommy for a bit and he wanted me to hone in on this next podcast, and I got deep sea mining, overfishing, and illegal sand mining. And he hit me over the head with some crazy facts, but I want to see where he starts out first. So Tommy, I'm going to hand the mic to you.
Well, thanks, Shannon. And a number of things that are really, near and dear to us, obviously, with the SourceMagnetic, with that company and what we're doing there in terms of the green energy and the green spaces, et cetera. There's another company that we have, which is 5 Oceans Global Solutions, which is really centered around the maritime space. And so we have some very exciting things that we'll slowly release over the next 6 months to a year on what we're doing, opportunities around that space and that company, as well as a particular boat launch, a yacht that we're building currently, and some of the things around that, which Shannon and I have talked a lot about. We've got some cool things that we're going to be doing with that space. So the illegal fishing component is something that's pretty near and dear to us, because we've worked on a number of projects in Africa specific to that, and dealing with the coastlines, et cetera. That's something that we're extremely interested in. And as you know, Shannon, we've talked about this, the illegal and the unreported and unregulated fishing, that's referred to sometimes as pirate fishing. I mean, it's reached alarming proportions globally, and it's a menace that particularly plagues a lot of the waters off of East and West Africa. So clearly it's something that we're very interested in. As you know, we're speaking with the government of Somalia right now to try to help them in terms of limited monitoring and enforcement capabilities along their coasts. So it's definitely something that we're extremely interested in. It's something that we definitely want to talk about in the African context, because as you know, the cost of illegal fishing to African economies is massive. It's colossal. There was a study that Shannon and I discussed, which was done by the Africa Progress panel, and it estimated that West Africa alone loses about $1.3 billion annually. That's a significant amount of money and significant resources that, were it not going to other countries, could obviously be put back into sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera. So I think just sub-Saharan Africa alone, it's almost $1 billion annually. So these are numbers that are quite staggering. And when you look at specific countries, the numbers are equally staggering. And I think, for example, we talked about Somalia, in some detail the other day, Shannon, and I believe those numbers were around $300 million, with Sierra Leone around 29 million per year to legal fishing. And these are countries that obviously rely not only on the natural resource itself to feed their people, but also, for export, et cetera. And right now, I think lobsters, things like that are coming in, or, it's really shrimp, things like that off the coast of Somalia. There's a real opportunity for export out of some of those areas. But if illegal fishing continues on the scale that it is, there's not going to be anything for the people, let alone to export.
Yeah, man. See, a lot of people don't realize, if you mess with the ecology, in one, you eliminate one fish, that fish has another fish that's dependent on it, and another fish that's dependent on that, and all the way up to the humans. And a lot of people just care about the money and don't think about all of the different chain of command that comes down from that. And I think that, talks like this are going to really, really bring that to the forefront and make people aware that it's just not just because you like one fish and you figured out a way to get a license and you're going to just get it, or people that don't get a license and decide to just go ahead and get that fish. There's repercussions to all that, and repercussions to the people, repercussions to the oceans. And the thing about it is, a lot of people don't care about the people, let alone the ocean. So one of our big focuses is the oceans, and illegal fishing is the start of it. So if you eliminate fish and specific fish from a specific area, that's going to trickle down, and people don't even think about that. And you got some countries that just think about feeding their countries, and they'll go to other places and just eliminate whole ecosystems. And we got to get smarter about that. And all of the nations have to figure out ways to kind of work with each other to be able to make sure that keeps at bay. I mean, it's a whole new frontier. I mean, whether it be the illegal fishing, and it goes from illegal fishing to the mining, because people know Africa for the minerals. I mean, Tommy, talk about the fact that, it's so many minerals under the ocean that people don't even realize, but some people that know about it are just attacking it, and then they're just messing up the oceans even more, whether it be from sound pollution to just killing the fish at will. I mean, what do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just, we're talking about the context of Africa, but we're really talking about a global, the global marketplace, if you will. You look at Asia, you look at a lot of Central South America, and one of the big culprits here, and we can't really discuss any of these things without talking about China. China is one of the big boys in terms of global fisheries. They send these ships into these various oceans, and they fish them out. They send these boats back. They load the fish up on another boat, and they send them back to to the mainland. And there's even there's been issues off the coast of West Africa where Chinese ships have just been put adrift. They've taken the crew off, they take the offtake, and then they let these vessels just float around. And then, having said that, there's other instances where, in the Pacific, et cetera, in Central South America, where, Chinese vessels, they've been boarded, and these guys put on their PLA uniforms, and then they have the support of the Chinese military. And that's happened in mostly in the Pacific arenas. But having said that, it's something that definitely has to be looked at, and the illegal fishing component cannot be talked about without talking about China as a major benefactor to, the illegal fishing. And again, when we start talking about West Africa and places like that, I think there's different monikers out there, if you will, or numbers that have come across the board. But I think UN puts it nearly 2.5 billion, in illegal fishing. That's a loss to West Africa. So that's huge. And so in the same vein, on the continent itself is the illegal mining that's set up, or these artisanal miners that are taken over by small countries, or by small companies rather, and that's causing a great deal of damage. Then you have the other side of it with groups like Wagner Group, what we've all heard about, Pogoshin and this group, coming out of Ukraine and going into Belarus. Well, they've got a big foothold in several West African countries, Central African countries, etc. And they're a big, part of this taking over of mines and doing great damage to communities in Africa. So then when you start to look at the ocean, that's a big problem for us, because I think there's so many things there that we don't quite understand when it comes to, offshore mining. And we're starting to think about deep sea mining as an opportunity and giving away licenses, for countries to go out there and companies to start, putting machines down on the bottom of the seabed and start to pull up these, polymetallic nodules, et cetera. Now there's pros and cons for that. One of our concerns is that I just don't believe that there's enough information that's been gathered that gives us a clear, understanding of what we're doing on these, these ocean seabeds, if you will. Is we've only been looking at this for a while, and when you start to think about, our time on station, so to speak, in terms of, what our biologists and, what other scientists have discovered down there, and then our understanding of what the consequences of mining will be, it's pretty one-sided, I think, to the degree that, the mining companies believe they can go down there and do this without any harm to the oceans. But I tend to disagree with that. When we look at what's taking place on land-based, activities and mines, especially in Africa, when you look in Lakasi and other areas in, in Congo and what was former Zaire, it's pretty dramatic, what took place there. So now we're talking about, sort of the greatest frontier, the last frontier that we have, and we're going to start mining down there without really fully understanding what we're pulling up. We know that in most cases, you take and I think these numbers are correct, is that I believe it takes about 1 million years. When you look at a nodule, it's, per centimeter, it's about 1 million years per centimeter. So if you're looking at a softball size, nodule that contains these cobalt, crusts and everything else, I think you're talking about 5 million years, to create one of those, if it's about 5 centimeters, in diameter. Well, that's pretty dramatic. So it took 5 million years, 1 million years, et cetera, to create some of these things. And we've only been studying these for maybe, let's just say 30 years. We first discovered some of these things back in the late, 1800s, early 1900s, and there just hasn't been enough studied around it. We don't understand the organisms. We don't understand the organisms, rather. We don't understand the biology down there. We definitely don't understand what the biodiversity looks like when you're thinking about removing these things from the ocean floor. So there's a great deal of, sediment and things that, that sort of take their time and sift themselves through through these layers and hit the ocean floor. So there's a lot of flora and fauna down there that we haven't even begun to understand. And each time a submarine has gone down to those depths, they've discovered something new. Each time a net goes down, we almost invariably discover some aspect of something we didn't know about the biodiversity down there, and or we find something new. So the idea of opening up these licenses, this year or even next year, I think is a little premature. We're probably 2 to 3 years away still from understanding what it takes to, fundamentally mine down there. Now, the pro for it is obviously that within the context of these polymetallic nodules, there's typical 3 or 4, minerals in the context of one nodule. So the argument is that, hey, you create a cobalt mine, and then you have iron ore, you have these other, so there are multiple mines, multiple opportunities, et cetera. Here, they're talking about one nodule, bringing it up, and it has 4 components to it. But again, I don't think we understand enough, in terms of when you're looking at the vast quantities of, valuable minerals like copper and nickel and cobalt and rare earth minerals that are said to be down there. I just don't think the knowledge that we have in terms of extracting them, we're not there yet. Now, there's a lot of, potential economic benefits, but I think the greater side of this is the is the environmental degradation, environmental disaster that we could be creating, not only for our children, but for our children's children. So we're clearly, not even decided halfway on how to solve the problems, up top here, in terms of the surface with respect to, electric cars and all the other things that we're currently talking about, where to get those minerals. So obviously jumping in when we've already created a little bit of a catastrophe up on, the surface, and now we're going to go underneath. I think that's probably a little bit of a bridge too far yet. But obviously a lot of hedge funds, a lot of mining companies that are pushing it, and I think a lot of countries that are looking to get something out of it. And the other thing that I would add here is this is not like, whether you're talking about child labor, whether you're talking about labor in general, anything that takes place in the context of Africa, is you look there and at least there's some semblance of something going back to the communities. We've already seen some instances that have taken place off the coast of Papua New Guinea and some of the Asian countries where some of these test beds have taken place, and there was no fundamental economic benefit to those countries. And then I would argue that on these vessels, these mining boats, these consortiums and companies that are going to be sending these billion-dollar platforms out, to go after these nodules, those are not going to be people that are hired from the local communities. That's number one. These are going to be very sophisticated people, engineers, et cetera, that maybe we get one or two from a Pacific Rim country or from an African country. But I would argue the bulk of those people are going to be coming from the more developed countries where that technology exists, the ROVs, the technology with respect to the mining equipment, et cetera. So that's just another point I think that we need to discuss, Shannon, and think about and definitely highlight to our viewers, is that a lot of the talk about the benefits, the economic benefits to these countries, I would say the other side is more the norm in terms of that there won't be this economic boom for a lot of these countries, unless of course they're getting money up front. And then even in that context, that still doesn't solve the problem of, do we understand enough to start these mining operations? We've been drilling oil, for almost a century now. And we look at the disasters that have happened from that. So now you're talking about very heavy equipment that's going down to the ocean floor, to the seabed, and disrupting that environment. And more importantly, the plumes that are going to be created. We've looked at a number of studies on that, and I don't think there's any conclusive evidence that shows just how good or bad it's going to be. But I would lean more towards the bad side than I would the good side when you're having a conversation about this, because simply there's not enough evidence to really understand, what that's going to look like. But nonetheless, it's going to happen. So I think what only thing we can do is really sort of have a call to action, which is to get, the people involved. You know what I mean? And the decision to mine the ocean floor is not to be taken lightly. I think it's something that it requires, a careful balancing of economic benefits and environmental risks. And I think right now those environmental risks are far too great for us to take a laissez-faire attitude and just start to, push it forward. So I'm hoping, clear heads, develop, because not only is this going to affect, what's underneath the ocean, it's going to affect, all the periphery things as well when we start talking about, the various environments.
Well, the other side of it, you got to think like this. I think the data is, we've only, as a human race, explored only 5 to 7% of the ocean. So if we've only really explored 5 to 7%, and we're down there mining and just doing all types of stuff without care of what's going on underneath, I think that's, number one, careless. Number two, they don't know what's underneath there, where you disturb the wrong thing, it can set off a chain of reaction that no one knows. It can be like Godzilla under there. So I mean, I talked to Tommy about that the other day. It's a little bit extreme, but you never know. You just drilling underneath the ocean with no remorse, and there's no data on this. I mean, Tommy mentioned earlier.
Again, Shannon, like, we were talking about, it's less about drilling, but having said that, it's more about, these platforms that we're putting down there. And while we were kind of joking about the Godzilla context, the Godzilla may turn out to be some, sort of tiny, microscopic, element that we find down there that, changes the course of history. We don't know what we don't know. And right now we don't know enough about the ocean and the seabed, to make those distinctions, to have these machines running. And we're really talking about, an area that really is the Pacific. That's where most of this is being looked at. And those fisheries out there are some of the greatest fisheries that we still have left on the planet. And whether you're talking about from a commercial perspective or, anything else, it's just really, we don't know enough, to really be going in there. And that kind of takes us back to, addressing some of those issues on the illegal fishing side. It's the same sort of thing. There's, a successful approach to tackling a lot of these issues requires, what we've discussed before, kind of a multifaceted, collaborative strategy that would include, the enhanced surveillance and enforcement, capacity building in many of these countries, and then policy and legislative reform. And a lot of times, and especially in the context of Africa, the policy and legislative reform, the laws and regulations, et cetera, those lag behind all the other activities. And then capacity building, as we've worked a lot with local communities in Kenya and Tanzania. And while some of those those communities are upstream, so to speak, that they're inland, they still live around rivers, and they still live around all these areas that, something they do that's 100 miles away that has an impact along the coast of Kenya and Tanzania. So I think, the capacity building in these areas to manage and conserve those, marine resources effectively, that becomes a national strategy. And it's something that obviously has to be discussed. It's kind of like when we think about, sort of the terrorism component, that you can't have a counterterrorism strategy without talking about local communities, and how they're being impacted. And we've seen that over and over throughout Africa and elsewhere, where you're trying to solve a problem, but there's no capacity building at the local level. And that's one of the things, obviously, that, Shannon and I spend a lot of time talking about, whether it's SourceMagnetic or Five Oceans Global Solutions, is that we're looking for ways to create, the cooperative strategies with these local communities and international bodies, to help augment local capabilities, if you will, whether that be monitoring, control, surveillance, and then on the other side, building up again the capacity within these communities. But nonetheless, it's something that we're very excited about, but we're also, trying to illuminate some of these topics here that we're very excited about. And obviously, when I say excited to bring these things to the forefront, because obviously there's nothing exciting about illegal fishing. It impacts, people across the globe, and then obviously the undersea and deep sea mining. It's something that can't be taken lightly. We need to spend more money in understanding what's going on. I know that MIT and Woods Hole and Scripps and a lot of these other groups that are out there are spending a lot of time and energy in looking at what it looks like when these plumes dissipate through the ocean, the body of ocean, if you will. So it's things that I don't begin to understand some of it. But the reality is we need to understand it, because it's obviously going to have a major impact, not just for us currently in terms of the fisheries, but more importantly for our children and grandchildren.
Well, let's go all the way back outside of the ocean. We talked the other day about sand, and Tommy gave me a crazy, it seemed crazy to me at the time. He asked me if I thought that sand was infinite, and I thought that sand was infinite, and it's not. And after we talked, I did a bit of research, and I did not realize that the earth is running out of sand. And if you say that to most people, they're going to think you're crazy. I mean, Tommy, just hit him over the head with this one.
Well, I mean, like we were talking about, it's kind of funny because it never really comes up until we start talking about building, materials, cement, sand, et cetera, and construction, across the board. When you look at, countries like China, that have spent the last 20 years, building, or let's not even say 20, let's say the last decade, putting infrastructure and buildings in a way that probably took us 50, 60 years, here in the United States. But I think you've looked at some numbers, haven't you, Shannon, in terms of the sand, piece and everything. But I always just like to throw that out there simply because it's one of those things that people believe that sand, just like a lot of things, on this big blue sphere that we live on, that they're endless. And they go, well, it's not the case. Sand is finite, and we are definitely running out of it. And I know that you took a few minutes to get some numbers. So why don't you hit our viewers and listeners out there with some numbers if you have them, Shannon.
I mean, just due to the fact that finding out that sand is running out, that blew me off. And I did a bit of research, and now understanding that, like with cement and what Tommy said, basically it takes for making any building, you need cement. And all of these new cities in the United States or around the world are going to take a lot of sand to make these buildings. So I ran into a number that said that for the amount of sand that it took to build all of the cities in the United States for the last 50 years. China used the same amount from 2011, between 2011 and 2015. So that's a huge number. And China's still building. But outside of China, you got a lot of up and coming countries that are just up and coming and they just want to grow themselves. So we can't be mad at them wanting to grow, but everybody's got to keep in mind that the sand is not infinite, and we got to figure out ways that we can really grow cities from now on, and really smart cities, because all of the smart cities that people think about are made of glass, and you can't make glass without sand. You can't make skyscrapers without sand. And keeping that in mind, it makes the smart city very interesting, especially when you come to the fact that the phone that you hold in your hand, the computer that you have on your desktop, it's all got sand in it. So after we figured that part out, it makes me think about sand and everything now. So what happens in 2050 when there's a finite amount of sand? And then also I found out that there's a sand mafia. I mean, Tommy, what happens with the sand mafia? Maybe talk about that a bit.
Well, it's kind of interesting, that we're even talking about this, because it kind of goes back to this environmental circle that we're kind of discussing right now, and the consequences of all these things. There's a consequence for everything, and I don't care what material it is, what sort of raw material it is. There's a group around it. There's a mafia around it that exists, that trades in sand, and most of this is illegal. And when we start talking about erosion, we have enough of a problem with rising sea levels, especially in the Pacific, parts of Africa, et cetera, that we're going to be running into over the next. So you're removing sand from some of these areas. That's obviously a big problem as well. But again, the reason we're bringing these things up, it's just to start the conversation around, hey, there are more things out there, and more little things, more tiny things that we need to be focused on, rather than just trying to overnight decide how we switch from combustion engines to electric engines, electric cars, etc. Because there's a consequence for that. I mean, the absurdity of what we're dealing with right now, especially look at California. We're going through a heat wave right now, so they're asking people not to plug in, don't charge your electric car. Okay, hold on a second. Now you've pushed everybody to do this, but now we don't have the resources to actually charge those vehicles. So the idea that we're going to, it just doesn't pencil out. It doesn't pencil out with a lot of things. And that's why, whether it's SourceMagnetic, Five Oceans Global Solutions, in terms of some of the opportunities and some of the, the projects and the voyages that we're going on, is to really start to the education piece and the advocacy piece. We have to be smarter about what we're doing, and we have to think about these things in a really fundamental way that doesn't bring emotions into it. Too many people are taking on this subject with too much emotion. We have to look at, how do we sustain this planet we live on, but more importantly, how do we do it in a way that's fundamentally correct? How do we get to yes, with deep sea mining, without just going full bore and issuing 500 licenses, or, it's more like 20 or 30. But the reality is that's the wrong answer. So I think, again, all these things, whether it's sand, whether it's natural resources in terms of, trees and timber, those are big problems, because the population is growing. We need those natural resources. And sometimes I think we want to take the viewing lens, if you will, off of the surface mining that we're conducting now, to say, hey, this is a good thing. Deep sea mining is going to be much easier, much better for the environment, et cetera. Well, when I hear that, we don't know that. And anybody that can show me any documents or anything, studies that fundamentally says that that's a better thing to do because of the problems we have at surface mining, I would argue that I just can't believe that. And I think we're probably 3 to 5 years away from having the fundamental material that we need just to start to make decisions on, okay, well, here's a test bed, let's run this and let's do these things before we start issuing multiple licenses. And then again, all of these things that we're talking about, we're talking about them because we're interested in this maritime and marine environment. Whether it's inland, everything inland has consequences for the ocean. And that's one of the things that we're really trying to, to harp on, if you will. But I think all of these things are extremely important when you start talking about, illegal sand mining. You're talking about, and to the extent that there's mining going on in the ocean, we haven't had that yet. This illegal mining with respect to deep ocean, because the resources required to fundamentally undertake those operations, it's extremely expensive. The machinery is expensive, the platforms are expensive. So luckily we haven't had that yet. So we still have time, for these groups, whether it's the consortiums or the UN bodies, et cetera, to make these decisions and do it in a fundamental way that gives the people of those regions a chance to, have some input as well. Because again, as I say, when you look at these operations, I don't see where there's a big opportunity for, maybe over a few decades, training programs, et cetera. But we've all seen how those programs tend to go, whether it be Mozambique, Nigeria, et cetera. Dan Godey started a lot of his own, operations in Nigeria simply because he was tired of working, with other companies that had training programs and things that were not benefiting, the local communities. And that's part of the reason why in the South, in those areas of Nigeria, there's been so many problems. Just the largesse, if you will, the money is not flowing back to those communities in the way that it should.
Yeah.
And that takes us back, what I mean, Shannon, that takes us back to that same conversation with the mining in South Africa, Namibia, and DRC, et cetera. There has to be a fundamental push. Yes, everybody wants to make money. These companies have to make money when they invest so heavily into those arenas, if you will. But having said that, there still has to be a cooperative engagement, with the local communities, ensure that those communities are being uplifted by those programs. And obviously, that's what you and I talk a lot about in terms of the programs and, the for-profit things that we do. Well, that also has to be, tempered, and it has to be shared. But there has to be a community development effort, across all of these lines. And it has to be well thought out. It's not just done a knee-jerk reaction to some, environmental group or some government group that says, oh, we've got to do this tomorrow. Well, we can't get there tomorrow. That's there's a lot of these things I don't think I'll see in my lifetime, but that's what we're setting up so that our children, our children's children can pick up the torch.
Yeah, man. I mean, when you think about it, for example, South Africa and Namibia, they have a lot of diamonds that are being, transported out of there and sold. So there has to be some different ways that the actual people on the ground can get some benefit off of that, outside of it just going outside and just, you know, making other people money, without the fact that meanwhile you have South Africa where a lot of areas are without power for hours out of the day. I mean, a lot of people don't even realize that, they just turn the power off for like 4 to 8 hours a day. I don't know the exact number, but
sometimes as high as 12 hours, Shannon, and probably longer. Those are the numbers that are being put out by the government, or local bodies. And again, it goes back to, when we were discussing Cyril Ramaphosa. These are fundamental issues that, appeared in this Economist article, et cetera. And, some of these, companies down there, like the chair of Nedbank and some of these other people, Ralph Mapita and, of MTN and some of these groups that were highlighted in this article in The Economist. I mean, they touched on that. That's what they saw as change with Cyril Ramaphosa coming in. But again, what you touched on with Namibia, yeah, I just have to guess, and I don't know this for sure, but I would have to imagine that if we didn't do diamond mining for a year, I would have to probably think that there's enough little vaults and things out there that are owned by these companies, that there's enough diamonds that I dare say we don't need to mine, for a year. So if you took that offtake and just say, that selling process, took it off the market, and that went back into the local communities in terms of the, the funds, whatever that process and that circle would look like, I would argue that you could uplift many of these communities. But again, that's a conversation that no one wants to have. So they don't have it until it's too late, until you start to have disruptions and, undermining communities, et cetera. And then the next thing you know, that is why we find that a lot of these groups that have, interspersed themselves, whether it's Al Qaeda, whether it's ISIS, whether it's, some of the terrorists, Al Shabaab, Boko Haram, why they start to get into local communities is that they start to disrupt the government. And then the next thing you've got fundamental problems that, that started out small and now they're turning into, nation state issues that has to be dealt with. And so again, the natural resources that are on that continent, it's really disgusting when you think about that the level of poverty. I mean, I don't think Soweto has changed a whole hell of a lot since the first time I went there back in the, back in the 70s as a young man. You know what I mean? There's still the fundamental issues that are going on, and the resources that are in South Africa and Namibia and Botswana, in those areas, it's fundamental. You know what I mean? There's so many natural resources. We just have to figure out how to use those wisely and take out the big C word, the corruption, whether that's from the commercial companies or whether it's from the government.
Yeah, I mean, just some small change. I mean, outside of it, we do want to do work with a lot of these nation states, and we're just offering opportunities and just pointing out things that are going on. But if we create some different ideas to make change, I think that's where everything starts. So if we can peel off somehow 1% out of the diamond exporting out of South Africa, maybe we might be able to make it so South Africa can keep their power on without being shut off even 1 hour. I'm not sure, but I'm sure that there's some random $1 million diamonds that are found every day in South Africa and exported. So just doing random numbers without being a genius rocket scientist. If you take 1% of that and apply it to their grid, maybe we might be able to keep a bit of more uptime, and we keep the uptime, and you have more, I guess, production out of South Africa. Most of these people that are going without power are the people that are not in the main city. So, we want to keep the people as productive as possible. And just little things like that, and thinking outside of the box and giving back to the people is going to make the people that much more productive.
Oh, absolutely. Well said. You know what I mean? You can't say it any better than that. There's definitely opportunities. It just takes, the right people, in the right places. And same thing with the environmental question. You have to take the emotion out of these things. We don't have time for, emotional people up there screaming, whether it's one side or the other, and, and destroying, artworks and all these things. That's not the answer. That's not solving problems. Let's spend a little bit more time and really start to look at how do we solve these problems. And then when there is a loggerhead, if you will, or there's a beachfront that needs to be, attacked, that needs to be done in a way that causes change. You know what I mean? And we know how those things work, and we know how change can be affected. But that's not necessarily the answer. And I think people believe that, hey, by destroying this thing or doing that, that's going to get somewhere, and it doesn't. It just makes both sides polarized against the other. And I just think a lot of the things that we're talking about and we're looking at over the next 3 years, these are things that we're hoping we bring back evidence and we bring back information, and we look at these things in a way that can help make determined decisions that lead to the successful implementation of programs in the future. And I think that's what's extremely important.
Yeah, and then to your point, Tommy, I mean, just to let everybody know, Tommy's been doing work on the continent for years, and the way that we're positioning this company is to make people aware of the possibilities. So, like on the last episode, we talked about a lot of optimistic elements of what's possible, and today we're talking about the challenges. But either way, we have an opportunity to be able to access the continent and be able to do business in the continent. And for the most part, when I was in school, at no point in my high school or prior or even college did they advertise to me to do business in Africa. I went to China to do some business in 2011. And I saw on TV that they were just advertising to the people to do business in Africa. And I've never seen or even thought that that was possible for anyone to do that. So that's why China's always there. They're advertising to the people to do business in Africa. And they're advertising to the people, not just, the people walking around with flies around them or anything weird or, poverty, donate $2. No, they're talking about what is possible and how to do business. So in a similar way, we're doing this and letting people know, hey, it's major opportunities possible to be able to do business with Africans in Africa. And if you're from the United States and you have a successful business and you want to expand and you want to figure out how to expand it outside of the United States, well, I mean, contact us. That's what this podcast is for, is to be able to start conversations and start international relations. And, at the end of the day, between my connections that I'm looking to expand, towards the continent, and Tommy's numerous years of being on the continent, speaking 7 different languages, we got a lot of opportunity here. So we just want this podcast to be a source of motivation and make you think. And if you got anything to contribute or ideas, definitely send us messages, send us email. And like we're looking to have some people on the show sometime soon. So Tommy, what are your thoughts?
That's excellent. It's great to follow up on, what I was about to say along those lines of, the partnership opportunities, with US companies, et cetera. Just in the conversations that we had, when you look at obviously the key focus, which is renewable energy and green tech, education and training, things like that. Just some of the areas that we've talked around maritime surveillance technology, sustainable, fishing and aquaculture, products, the environmental consultancy side of it, and then ocean mining companies with respect to whether it's their technology or their advocacy. There's so many opportunities just in those spaces for companies, not just from the US, but from elsewhere to go into Africa. Obviously, our primary focus is creating that connection and that collaboration between US entities, individuals, companies, et cetera, and the continent, because that's why we started a lot of this. To Shannon's point is, China advertises across the board, on all kinds of opportunities out there, and they actually facilitate things in a way that our government doesn't necessarily do so. And so that's why we're doing this, because I love the continent so much. I love the people. I love the opportunities out there. And again, most of our revenue comes from that continent, and most of our opportunities that we've had over the last probably 4 decades have come as a result of doing business on that continent. And so we've been able to, get people over there, to get people into locations like Kenya and South Africa and Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique, et cetera, places that you typically wouldn't think of as places to move to. But, we've been successful at that because people are always looking for opportunities and change. And again, you don't know what you don't know. And a lot of people don't like that saying, but the reality is it's true. If you don't know what you can do there, it's just like what we've talked about before, Shannon, you and I in our conversations. If I don't know, I'm growing up in an area that say is sort of disenfranchised, et cetera, and I don't know what an attorney is. So how can I become one, until much later on? Becoming a Navy SEAL, becoming, anything that's sort of outside of the norm. Typically, if I don't know about it, how can I become one? So in this context, we're just trying to, illuminate the continent and talk about some successes that we've had there. And we'll start to do that over the next few podcasts. And to Shannon's point, we're going to start to bring on some interesting individuals to actually, elevate our conversations and also illuminate more just the beauty of that continent. So that's probably a good way to end it from my side, Shannon.
Yeah, man. So no, I appreciate you, Tommy, and letting people know your thoughts, and just, again, you had me at the sand is running out, but outside of that, man, we got to look at how we're actually consuming all resources and keep that in mind every day, whether they be, on land or off land. Really cool different organizations like the Ocean Cleanup, people that are cleaning up the big Pacific Ocean patch, keeping people from using a lot of plastics, to, just thinking about how to use resources. That's what we're going to be illuminating with our podcast. We're going to be helping people with, understanding how education and training works, and really bringing businesses to light and getting businesses access to the continent. So that's what we're doing with SourceMagnetic, and we're happy to connect you with the right people and the right resources. And, together we'll make change. And hey, let us know what you think about this podcast. We appreciate you tremendously. Tommy, I appreciate you tremendously. You got any parting words?
No, likewise. I appreciate, all the work you're putting in this, and, another couple of shout outs. I think MIT is doing some incredible work, in deep sea, environments, as well as Woods Hole. And then obviously one of the 501c3s that we donate to, which is Five Oceans. That's a great organization, and they're starting to do a lot of interesting things that even SourceMagnetic is supporting as well. So that's about all I have, my brother.
Appreciate you, Tommy. Hey, stay tuned to the next Source Magnetic podcast, and be sure to like, subscribe, and hit us up with your thoughts. And if you got any different ideas or anything that you want to illuminate us on, definitely feel free to let us know in the comments. Stay tuned. I appreciate you guys, and looking forward to talk to you soon.